What's up, everybody? Welcome to a brand new episode of Part of the Problem. I am Dave Smith. Very excited for today's episode. Okay, a couple of quick things. Let me get them out of the way, and then we'll get right into it. Number one, tomorrow, I'm headed up to Buffalo, New York. I'll be there with Robbie the Fire Bernstein. Or no, I'm sorry, Friday and Saturday. No. Thursday and Friday in Buffalo, and then Saturday night in St. Catharines. 2 shows up there. The first one is already sold out. The second one is going to sell out. If you want to come, grab tickets now, comicdavesmith.com. And then the other, you get all the ticket links for my calendar for the rest of the year there. Then the other thing is, of course, remember, I am returning to the Soho Forum in May, debating Alex Norwestesh. I still don't know how to say his last name, from the Cato Institute. We'll be debating immigration. Tickets for that are moving quickly. So if you are in the New York City area and you want to come out, go to thesohoforum.org to get tickets there. And also, if you're in the New York City area, go check out one of Gene Epstein's debate series there. It's sohoforum.org is a great organization, great debate series. Gene Epstein is one of our best guys, and I always enjoy everything he does. Okay. We got back on today's show, the legend, Scott Horton, antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and of course, the author of this phenomenal book, Provoked, which is really the book you need to read to understand the buildup to the current catastrophe in Ukraine, and really a whole history of U.S.-Russia post-Soviet relations. And it's really a wild story, and it's I'm sure it's kind of been cool for you, Scott, that so you wrote this phenomenal book years ago called Fool's Errand, and it was about the war in Afghanistan. And then you wrote Enough Already, which was about all of the terror wars. But it did feel like those books, it was a recent history. I mean, okay, Afghanistan, I think, was still going on as you wrote the book, but it had totally been accepted that, like, yes, this war was a disaster. It was kind of, everyone had agreed, the same with the terror wars too. This thing is like, your book is coming out, you're still in the middle of your book tour, and it's become like the biggest issue that everybody's talking about. So that right away has got to be kind of interesting from your perspective.
Yeah, and I'm getting almost universally good feedback from it. I've had very little substantive criticism, a lot of Russian asset and Russian talking point type garbage. But on a substantive basis, they seem to have not read the thing, because they'll accuse me of never addressing stuff that has a whole section of its own and whatever in there. I don't know. So, but look, it did get up to the top 300 on all of Amazon. It's now still in the top 1,000. It's, I believe, in the top 700 something, or 600. No, I think 700 something on Amazon. It's still number 1 in War and Peace, and still in the top 40 in all history on Amazon. So, and that's 3.5 months. And if it wasn't for Jimmy Carter dying and Dave Chappelle recommending his book, Peace, Not Apartheid, on Saturday Night Live, then I'd have been number 1 in War and Peace the whole time. But Jimmy Carter he snaked my title for a minute there, but I got it back.
That's good. People were reading that book. It's not a bad book for people to read. I've never read it, but I'm familiar with the thesis of Jimmy
know
Carter's
what trouble
book.
He got in for writing it, so it must be something.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's jump right into this the latest, because this really is, and it's we've been living through such a crazy few years in this country. And as someone who does a show, I talk about this a lot, but when you do a show about the news, it's almost like there's something crazy every single day to talk about, and there's always like a new thing. And it's sometimes it's a challenge to kind of like zoom out and see things from, like a transcendent position and like 10,000 feet above looking down. This meeting with Zelenskyy and Trump in the Oval Office was one of those things where it's like, this was really, truly remarkable. I've never seen anything quite like it in my life. And it's just, I want to get your thoughts on it, and then we could get into the kind of what's come after. But I my first thought on it was just that this was, it's got to be like the greatest political strategic blunder I've ever seen. And I don't, I've read a lot about this conflict. I don't necessarily have like a good understanding of who Zelenskyy is, but I don't know, like, what your thoughts on that? Like, who was in his ear? Why did he think this would be a good move? And when you're in a position where you're totally dependent on Donald Trump, the idea that you would come in and try to like out alpha him on live television and in a language that you don't really speak, and to think that was going to go well for you. I mean, like, what were you thinking when you first saw it?
Well, I mean, yeah, I was a bit just in disbelief. In fact, the second time I watched it, I finally found the clip of the whole deal, the 40-minute long discussion leading up to it and everything. And I was impressed the first time, but the second time I watched, I was like, wow, I really had not remembered just how bad it was. Him attempting to shout down Trump and talk over Trump in that way was pretty remarkable. I think, well, we got two choices, right? One is he just couldn't stand anymore and he had to blurt something stupid out and he's like kicking himself now, which I think is the less likely explanation. Or that this was, a planned political move that he made, because essentially what was happening was Trump was saying, we're going to call this ceasefire. That's what we're going to do. We want a deal where the fighting stops, implying, of course, then that everyone accepts that the lines are where they're drawn now.
Right.
And potentially, maybe in negotiations, they would even grow, right? Because as it stands now, Russia still doesn't control 100% of Donetsk, nor of Zaporozhye or Kherson, although they do control, I believe, virtually all of Luhansk and some of Kharkiv. But so this is Zelenskyy, I think, had already decided that Trump was throwing him overboard and wasn't going to keep supporting him in war anyway. And that, I don't know what the deal, the minerals is hardly worth anything. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but that's basically a red herring for the most part. But so I think his decision was that instead of cut and running from the war, he just wanted to cut and run from the United States and say, fine. Because, of course, if America stops backing him, we can't really make a deal with Russia to end the war if Ukraine's not willing to end the war, and we can call off all support, and then they will be, in a much tougher situation. But it won't just be like the Taliban walking right into Kabul or anything like that. The Russians will still have a fight on their hands, at least for a time. And so Zelenskyy apparently is betting then that he can just turn to the Europeans and essentially bet on their center-left, last status quo position, the common, call it whatever you want, the woke standard of the Biden administration, and that they will, distance themselves from Trump, who is, he's the rogue and the right-wing nationalist. And so they are left, they're calling, Keir Starmer, is that how you pronounce it? They're calling him the leader of the free world now, because Donald Trump is the isolationist turning his back on Europe and all this, which is, vast hyperbole on both counts. But you do have, it's kind of funny to see, right? The British, the French, and the Germans are talking about, well, and I think the Poles as well, we're not going to sell you out. We're going to continue to back you no matter what, Ukraine. And with the British Prime Minister even promising with boots and planes, he said. And I would be worried about that, except that I just don't believe him. I think the Europeans have already all admitted that without the United States to guarantee their guarantees, they have nothing to offer, really. The British can't fight a war on the continent, and I don't think the Germans really are coming and willing to risk that level of war over Eastern Ukraine, and without support from the United States and knowing that they don't have it. So, I agree with you that it was ultimately a strategic blunder. I think it was deliberate, but I think it was a huge mistake because just like the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, and the then current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, had said back in October of 2002, I guess even still in September, they said, this is as good as it's going to get for you. Quit now while you're only this far behind. It's time to come to the table and negotiate. And, we already knew what happened, but there's a profile of Antony Blinken, the outgoing Secretary of State here, in the New York Times, where they call him Secretary of War. And they talk about how, of course, it was he and the State Department weenies that won over Biden and won the argument in the government that, no, we need to extend the war. And remember then, they were going to launch the winter offensive, which became the spring offensive, which finally, when they launched it, was the summer offensive and got nowhere and just got a whole bunch of people killed for nothing. And this was the big gamble that Blinken had made to continue the war, when the four stars were saying it's all downhill from here. So you got a good, and they did, by the way, the occasion at the time, Dave, was that on the weekend of September 11th, the Ukrainians had done this great feint and had made major gains in Kharkiv province Oblast, and also down in Kherson, where they had essentially forced the Russians back to the southern and eastern side of the river there. And so that was, to their credit, but then that was all they were going to get. And all the actual reasonable pundits on this knew it at the time too. Everybody wise who you would turn to for any opinion on this kind of thing at all that you could find all said the same thing, which was, even Mark Milley is saying quit now, which that should have been all you need to know.
Yeah, really. I mean, it's wild to think about. And I guess this is just, I'm like, I don't know. I guess I'm old enough now that I've lived through like 9 wars or, whatever it's been. And it is amazing how they just all follow this pattern where it's like, okay, first of all, everybody hyperventilates about this imagined worst case scenario. There never really seems to be an onus on you to demonstrate that it's a likelihood or anything like that. But, whatever, Saddam Hussein's about to give the weapons he doesn't have off to the terrorists that he's not friends with. And then Kansas gets nuked. And, with this war, it's been constantly, Vladimir Putin's going to reconstitute the Soviet Union. He's going to move on Poland. He's going to do all these things. Then there's just lie after lie after lie. In this war, there was, the ghosts of Kiev, and Vladimir Putin blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, and just all these things that serious people in suits and ties say into cameras that are just all completely wrong.
Yeah, time is on Ukraine's side. That was the big one, right?
Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is winning was constantly being said, and throughout the whole thing. Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and Blinken all in this said that even Crimea has to be retaken by the Ukrainians, as if that was like even a kind of achievable goal. And then as the dust starts to settle, you start to look back at the thing. I don't know. I've seen different estimates of the numbers of dead, but it seems to be a consensus that it's in the high hundreds of thousands at this point, at least. Well, I guess we'll find out more over the years. And then you look back and you think about how Stoltenberg, I always butcher that name, but the head of NATO said himself that in late 21, Vladimir Putin actually sent a draft to NATO to just be like, listen, here is a deal. I will not invade if you just put in writing that you won't bring Ukraine into NATO. And to think about that like how much better that deal would have been for Zelenskyy than what he's like. NATO's already off the table. They're not getting in NATO anyway. And to think that literally they could have kept everything except Crimea, or they weren't getting Crimea back at that point, but whatever. They would have lost Crimea, kept the integrity of the rest of Ukraine, just agreed to not join NATO. And all these people, the country wouldn't have had to be destroyed. All these conscripted troops on both sides wouldn't have had to die. It really is like maddening when you look at it in totality. All right, guys, let's take a moment and thank our sponsor for today's show, which is Tax Network USA. If you owe back taxes or your tax returns are still unfiled, maybe you missed the deadline to file for an extension, the IRS may be ramping up enforcement. You could face wage garnishment, frozen bank accounts, even property seizures if you haven't taken action yet. But there's still hope. Tax Network USA has helped the taxpayer save over $1 billion in tax debt and has filed over 10,000 tax returns. They specialize in helping people like you reduce their tax burdens, and they can help you too. Don't wait any longer. Visit them today at tnusa.com/Smith, or you can give them a call at 1-800-958-1000 for a free consultation. Their experts will walk you through a few simple questions to see how much you can save. Act now before the IRS takes more aggressive steps. Take control today. Visit tnusa.com/Smith or call them at 1-800-958-1000. All right, let's get back into the show.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the medium-term future here at minimum just completely sucks for everybody as well, because, you know, no matter exactly how the war finally comes to an end, Russia's not losing that territory. They have essentially, you know, absorbed the most pro-Russian population of Ukraine into Russia just by expanding the line around them. But what that means is they've moved them out of Ukraine. And so now nobody in Ukraine is pro-Russia anymore, or,
Right.
you know, the ones who you know, are even sympathetic at all are going to be far more marginal in Russian politics now, which is going to be even more heavily dominated by the, you know, nationalists from far out west who absolutely hate Russia. And I don't know if they're going to be allowed. I don't think they ever will be allowed to join NATO, but they may still join the EU, and they still will be, you know, antimatter force stuck right there sharing a border with matter in the form of Russia from now on. And so I expect there to continue to be problems, you know, kind of ongoing even after the Civil War or the major war comes to an end, and including what could be a Nazi-based insurgency led by the likes of Andriy Beletsky and Dmitry Yarash and these others who, you know, it is, after all, a massive country, and the Russians still only control like the eastern and southern fifth of it, right? I mean, it's the size of Texas, which there's a reason the size of Texas is a cliche. It's because it's huge.
Right.
It's the same as Afghanistan. So now a lot of it is barren steppe and not very conducive to insurgency, but they do have some forests and some swampland and some other places where they could be based out of. And so I'm sure there are those who would want to continue to fight over the long term. I don't know whether the national, you know, central state would be able to stop them or not. I don't know that this is what Zelenskyy is thinking, but he has reason to fear that these guys will kill him if he makes peace. They've said that they would over and over again. Even before the war, when he first took power in 2019, they threatened to kill him over all the guys who died in the war so far. So you want to talk about, you know, the sunk cost fallacy. After all that they have sacrificed, he's going to sell them out now. Like, he has reason to flee home to the Brookings Institution after that, man, or they could have his ass. So that may be part of his calculation here. Is there are some in Ukraine, and it's, I think, far from the majority, but there are some who would rather never give in and keep fighting to the death no matter what. And so that may be part of his calculation, maybe not. But I think, well, I'll be very interested to see after, especially yesterday, where he said the war is going to continue for a very long time, and then Trump denounced him for talking like that even, and all this. The break is getting solidified, and things can change quickly. There's so much at stake that people can say sorry and shake hands and do different things and maybe try to get back on the same page. But, you know, as we're recording this, essentially his stance is we're going to keep fighting without you, and you can't make peace without us. And so who holds the cards now?
Well, I guess we will see what happens. I mean, I got to say, I was really blown away by the level of disrespect that Zelenskyy showed Trump and Vance. And I was talking about this today on the I was recording with Tom earlier today, and I think I mentioned this on the last podcast as well. But there is look, I'm not a conservative. You know, I'm a right-wing liberal like Murray Rothbard or something like that, but I'm not like a conservative. There are things that, do you remember, like, I remember Pat Buchanan, who I have, tremendous respect for, but I remember, do you remember there was something where Obama, I think he took a picture in the Oval Office with like his suit jacket off, and he just had like a shirt and tie. And I remember Pat Buchanan being furious about this. It was like, it's disrespectful to the Oval Office or something like that. Like, I'm not that. I don't really care. I'm not a suit and tie guy. I never wear a suit and tie, almost never. But I gotta say, it was very strange to me that he comes dressed like that. Like, you don't put on a suit and tie and Trump cares about that. That's the type of thing Trump really cares about, like looking TV ready or whatever. But I was blown away that he referred to the vice president as JD.
Yeah.
Like, that to me was like, when Rogan floated out the idea of having the podcast with me and Trump and Joe Rogan, which I, probably won't happen, but would be cool if it ever did. But like, in that, like, I would refer to him as Mr. President. I would never sit there and say, Donald, the thing is that, you know what I mean? Like, that just seems crazy to me.
That could have been a translation mistake type of a thing too.
Possible.
But yeah, so don't fight with the president and vice president when you don't speak the language properly, right? As you already said, they're like, are you sure you're fluent enough to get in this crap right now in this situation? And so that was a huge error to do, right? To say, look, JD, but then importantly, what was the statement? He was disregarding what he said. Like, listen, you're talking about negotiating with Putin, but you can't negotiate with Putin. You're essentially a fool to say that you can negotiate with this guy. He must be made to lose the war first, and then you have to give me a war guarantee. And so that was when Vance said, not, hey, how dare you call me JD, but I can't believe, he actually said, like, actually astonished, wow, I can't believe you want to litigate this right here in public with us, because guess what? You're going to lose the argument now. You might have had a chance backstage, I think was the implication there. But dude, you're going to come at me like this? But the thing is too, they should have already agreed. Everybody talks about the deal. Well, which deal? You're talking about a ceasefire and Russia stays where they are? Or you're just talking about this mineral deal, and then who knows what's going to happen in peace negotiations later, et cetera, right? Most of the actual minerals are not rare earth minerals, but there are other minerals in the country, but they're all under Russian control in the Donbass. So now I think there must be some east of the river there, but mostly it's wheat fields, and those have already been gangsterized by Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland and Monsanto Company back in the Obama years. So I don't know if they're still there now. They might be biding their time until the war ends to go back in and monopolize all that grain, or triopolize it, I guess. But it used to be illegal for foreign multinational corporations to come in and buy up all that Ukrainian grain. But America just overthrows the government when the wrong guys win over there. So they changed the law to make it okay. So that's a huge part of, I don't know exactly their role in lobbying for the war, but it's a huge part of American-based multinational corporations' interests in Ukraine is all that grain, not just the potential natural gas resources and coal and iron and whatever in the East.
So it seems to me that coming out of this, this altercation in the Oval Office, I mean, look, the big Donald Trump did announce he's halting all weapon sales to Ukraine. It does seem like, and why don't you kind of alluded to, maybe we could talk about this
again.
Yeah, well, it really is something. I mean, it is there's nothing more dangerous you can do in DC than end a war. I mean, that is a grave crime to them. So that really is high crimes and misdemeanors. I mean, that's the worst crime you can commit, is ending a war. So he might have to get impeached.
And they really mean it. I mean, even when I say this, I know it sounds silly. Like if somebody was too young or not paying attention at the time or just on vacation or something, if I tell you, I know it sounds nuts to say, but it's really true. The third time ever that the Congress impeached the president of the United States of America. It was Donald Trump for temporarily holding up an arms shipment to Ukraine, which Ukrainians all agreed they didn't even notice was late. What late shipment? I don't even know what you're talking about. We weren't even due another crate for another 6 weeks or whatever it was. Nothing happened at all in the name of an extortion that did not take place. The whole thing was completely phony. It's unbelievable.
Well, they all called it a quid pro quo, but it wasn't. There was nothing. It was an attempted quid pro quo that wasn't even clearly like
Not even, yeah.
It's because the truth is that for Donald Trump, like if Donald Trump had asked them to manipulate evidence or had asked them to frame Joe Biden, then you'd have a real, like you'd have something there. You'd have like a case on your hands. But to ask them to investigate behavior that is questionably criminal is just like, and then he never got the investigation and they got the weapons. I mean, I remember arguing about this at the time. I go, here's where your case really falls apart. Okay. None of this ever happened. Right. And so like, what are you really arguing?
It's the biggest asterisk in the whole world too, which is that the FBI had Hunter Biden's laptop for 3 months leading up to the impeachment, which was in January of 20. And so on that laptop, anyone can now read emails back and forth between Hunter Biden and the leaders of Burisma, promising them that he's going to intervene in American politics to protect them from prosecution. It's all right there. And then what do? Not only did they not leak that, this is the FBI, the land of 10,000 leaks against Donald Trump. They got the biggest leak in the world that would spare him in the middle of being impeached. And they keep that all buried under wraps and behind a grand jury and whatever it is. And then what do they do with it? In the months in the lead up to the election, when they know that Giuliani also has the laptop, and this is going to be the Republicans' big October surprise, they go to all the social media companies and the major media companies and tell them, beware of incoming Russian disinformation accusing Hunter Biden of doing something wrong with this gas company, Burisma. And so then when it comes out, they're able to censor the entire thing. You're talking about rigging the election. And it was the FBI and the CIA that did it. His own
100%
did it to him.
And then
unbelievable.
And literally, I mean, this is like, I mean, you have every piece of evidence. I mean, because it sounds crazy to say this, but this is really what they did. And that even when Rogan asked Zuckerberg about the Hunter Biden story, his first response was, well, the FBI came and told us that this big Russian dump was coming. And so that was obviously that. And then they came out and said that was the Russian disinformation, right? When they signed that famous or infamous letter. And so,
we know that the New York Times' Scott Shane was at the tabletop exercise where they warned him about all of this. And then when all the censorship regime came out with the laptop, he didn't say nothing about it. Same for Noah Schachman at Rolling Stone, who is otherwise most famous for being for helping to cover up the most disgusting, unspeakable crimes of his buddy, James Gordon Meek from ABC News.
Yeah. Well, so it seems to me, let's get in a little bit to like this. I mean, you touched a little bit on the mineral stuff and the mineral deal, but I think it seems to me that possibly the best thing to come out of this fiasco in the Oval Office is that maybe Donald Trump does just walk away from this silly idea. And, there is, as you know, me and you have talked about this a lot over the years, and I will like, I'll kind of preface this by saying that I'm quite happy with some of the things coming out of this administration. I mean, it's been a mixed bag. There's been some really positives and there's been some negatives. But that already, from our perspective, is like, oh my God, we never get positives. Like, this is amazing. Like, at least something's happening. I love that even just the way that Elon Musk and Donald Trump have kind of mainstreamed the idea of how corrupt and wasteful the government is with our money is great. And the stuff on Ukraine really has been the best part probably of all of it. The problem with Donald Trump seems to be that, now I know I'm repeating myself from the last show, but I want to get your thoughts on this, but it's like everything good about Donald Trump is always instinctual. It's always like his gut tells him, this doesn't make sense. 20 years of war and we're spending $8 trillion. And what do we have to show for? That's bad business, but none of it ever comes from like a philosophical grounding or a deep knowledge of the story of the history. And so he's very susceptible to getting distracted by shiny objects. It's very like, this war is bad business. It doesn't make any sense. And someone be like, we could take the oil. He goes, well, now we're talking business, and like you could get this. And it does seem to me that he constantly was he was going back and forth for the whole campaign for 24. He would go back and forth between saying like perfect stuff and then saying like Europe should pay more. You know, like as if like, oh, okay, it would be okay to keep the war going as long as Europe was paying more. But then sometimes he'd say like and it does seem to me that he was, at least the way he was presenting it publicly, was that he was selling this to Zelenskyy as like, look, this is kind of the best security guarantee that you can get from us. Like if we're in business together, then if Putin comes and messes with you, he's kind of messing with us too. But it can't be stated enough that that's the whole point, is that we don't want to do that. And that's what this whole war started over to begin with. And you know, I know it's like, it's easy to get, look, like you wrote a very big book on this subject. There's a lot of very interesting details in there. And I know people argue about all of this stuff but it's almost like to zoom out and just look at how insane this policy is, that even when the Soviet Union existed, when there actually was the Soviet Union, we only gave the security guarantees to Western Europe. Not even the eastern part of Germany had a security guarantee. And now we're like, what are we talking about? A security guarantee for Luhansk? Like, what is going on that we would think that, like, it's just such madness. And it's like Donald Trump, while he's correct in wanting to end the thing, he just doesn't even get that part of it, that the whole lesson here should be like, no, the last thing we want. I mean, to me, it was appalling to have Zelenskyy demanding security guarantees from us. Like, what? You're entitled to us? I mean, what is the security guarantee? You're saying we have to be ready to fight a war on behalf of your country? Sorry, like, screw you. No, we don't. All right, guys, let's take a moment and thank our sponsor for today's show, which is Monetary Metals. I love this company. They are truly revolutionizing the precious metal space, and just great people who run the company as well. As many of you know, gold prices have been breaking all-time highs in 2024, but now, because of Monetary Metals, you can get your gold to work for you, generating interest income every month, paid in additional ounces of physical gold. You can earn up to 5% on your gold and silver in their lease offerings, and accredited investors can even earn double-digit returns in their bond offerings. Again, all the interest is paid in ounces, which are stored for free on your behalf. So if you're tired of your gold and silver collecting dust at home, or worse, racking up fees having your metal professionally stored, check out monetary-metals.com to learn how you can start putting your metal to work today. That's monetary-metals.com. All right, let's get back into the show.
Yeah, you know, Kyle Anzalone has a great show on YouTube, and he had clips of these congressmen talking about, you know, yeah, it'll have to be like the Korean model where we'll stay forever. This is how John McCain talked about Iraq
right.
Back 20 years ago, that like, oh yeah, no, we can never come home from there. And that just makes no sense at all. If you're not willing to fight for them now, but you're willing to fight for them then after they've already lost, what's the point of that? The whole thing is crazy. And then having some workers there as a security guarantee, some miners that essentially they'll serve as a tripwire for war, that Russia would always think not just twice, but even 3 times about invading because American miners could get caught up in it and they don't want trouble with us. Well, if you're going to do that, then it would make more logical sense to put combat forces there who could actually be a deterrent of some kind. Not that I'm recommending that, but I'm just saying it makes no sense to have, you know, like we have in Korea, our soldiers are not there to really, there are not enough of them there to deter an attack or to defeat an attack from North Korea, probably, but they are a tripwire. That means if North Korea ever attacks South Korea, our guys will be caught up in it. And that'll mean the rest of the USA is also coming. And so, yeah, it just makes no sense whatsoever to this whole damn war, Dave, has been fought for the principle that Ukraine can too join NATO someday in the long-term future from now, which we're absolutely not willing to let them in now, which might have been a deterrent, although I think it would have caused the war sooner, but we're not willing to give them a war guarantee. But we're willing to help them get into and lose a 3-year war, you know, on the principle that no one else can say that they can't join. And so, you know, back to, as I say in the book over and over again, I cite all of these hawks, not the opponents of NATO expansion, and which included not just our heroes like Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul, but and Ted Galen Carpenter and other of our guys, but including vast parts of the foreign policy establishment were against this. But then even the expanders, like Richard Holbrooke, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Henry Kissinger and others, they all said, well, of course we have to make a special exception for Ukraine. Of course, they have to have some kind of, they all said the same thing.
Yep.
Like Austria or Finland during the last Cold War, where they don't have troops occupying their country from either side. They're not in NATO and they're not in the Warsaw Pact, and they're just neutral, and will do the same kind of thing for Ukraine. Forgive me if I'm being redundant. I forgot what I said on your show last time, but there's a guy named Ken Pollock who was sort of the liberal hawk who told all the liberal Democrats it was a good idea to support W. Bush's war in 2003. He was like best buddies and writing partners with a guy named O'Hanlon, Michael O'Hanlon, who's maybe a little bit more prominent, but they're sort of alter egos, these guys. Anyway, so they're like, you know, Brookings Institution guys, right? Like very center left liberal Democrat war hawks. And he wrote a monograph that came out in 2018 saying we gotta, you know, have a new treaty that guarantees no further NATO expansion and neutrality for Ukraine and this permanent arrangement security structure. And he had war guarantees built into it and the rest too. But still, like, it was important that he was recognizing that we have gone too far in trying to take Ukraine away from Russia. And of course, they're reacting just like everybody knew that they would. And so we should, you know, call it off here before a real war breaks out, before it gets so much worse than this, at that time, low-level civil war under, you know, the partially implemented Minsk II deal, let's say. And so they all knew better. They all knew this was the consensus, was that we shouldn't do this, that it makes no sense to bring them into NATO and give them an Article 5. If Russia knew that was happening, they would invade before the ceremony and the ink was dry on the page, or they would, you know, immediately test the alliance by moving right in there. As Putin said back in 2014, although, you know, a little bit optimistic, he said, I could be in Kiev in 2 weeks. Which in fact, his guys did get almost to Kiev before they stopped because they were in the middle of negotiating a peace deal, one that America and Britain ruined. This is after the war had already begun. The Istanbul deal, which would be the basis of the deal that they're trying to get right now. And at the time, of course, the two major issues was NATO expansion and the ongoing civil war. And they were willing to accept the Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk both staying in Ukraine under a strong federalism type situation, but still as part of Ukraine, not completely independent and not part of the Russian Federation, if they could have got the deal. And, you know, you quoted Jens Stoltenberg earlier. You almost had it right. You just added an R, but Stoltenberg, you're right. He had cited that treaty, that Russia proposed a treaty to NATO and the United States, just sign this very simple deal and this won't happen. And they basically just ignored that. And I'm sorry, I was going to make one more point there.
Well, Stoltenberg was bragging about it. He was bragging that, like, see, and now Vladimir Putin just got more NATO expansion. So, look at that. You know, so like, but the thing that he gave away, which is, sure, go ahead.
On top of him was Zelenskyy himself gave that statement to CNN where he said, they told me behind the scenes, look, we're not going to bring you into NATO. But in public, we're going to pretend like we're going to someday, and we want you to continue to act like that's going to happen and all this. And he explained all this in frustration on CNN, that they had him in this weird bind where they were promising that, you know, someday we'll protect you, but not now, even though we know promising to someday protect you now is going to get you into a war now. And he's saying, what the hell kind of a situation is this for you to put me in? And then, but he continued to go along.
Yeah, you know, it is, you know, like as John Mearsheimer's now famous line back in 2014 was that the U.S. is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And it is, I mean, it's one of the great ironies of all of this is that all of the people who like changed their flags to their Twitter bios to Ukrainian flags and all the hawks on this. It's like they're the worst enemies of the Ukrainian people. And it certainly seems that Zelenskyy, another lie, or at least quasi lie that was told, throughout this whole thing, is how much the Ukrainians just want to fight. And they just want to fight and want to fight. Except like, then you start seeing the stories of how like violently conscripted this army is. I think there were over 100,000 people were charged with desertion or something like that. It's like, well, it doesn't sound like those people wanted to fight that much. I'm sure there are some others who did, but it is, it's obviously the best thing for the Ukrainian people would be to end this conflict. And, I guess one of the things that people will come back at us with, as you hear on like on the Piers Morgan show or something like that, when we're debating some of these guys, they'll say like, well, look, it's not right that Vladimir Putin gets to invade this country and then keep parts of their territory, and it's just like that can't be rewarded or something like that. But as you pointed out, which is I didn't watch the full of your episode, but I did see one of the clips on Twitter of your latest appearance, where you at one point asked, and I'm guessing no one gave you a good answer on this, but you asked like, okay, so what's the plan here, guys? Like, what do you want to do about it? The way I put it, as I've used this example like several times, because I think there is this kind of like empire mentality that Americans are plagued with. But when you say things like that, I think to a lot of Americans that does kind of ring true. Like, yeah, can't just let people do that, and if they do that, then China's going to go take Taiwan, which is the another assertion of what will happen, which without much evidence to like demonstrate that it's going to. But I said this on Piers Morgan the other day, and it seemed to hit home with some of the panel. But I was like, look, let's just say we decided we were going to take Mexico City. Like, for whatever reason, let's just say that the American people wanted to do it. The political class wanted to do it. We had the political will. We're going to take Mexico City. What could Russia do about that? What could China do about that? Should they allow us? Isn't it just an absurd question already? Because as soon as you go, should China allow us? You go, allow? What do you mean allow? You have no say in this. And so like, it is, I guess, a little bit of a weird like thing for libertarians like us to be saying. It's not our ideal scenario in the world. It's just accepting the world as it is. But like, yeah, I guess it kind of sucks to be a little state next to a big, more powerful state. Just as Kamala Harris explained, Russia's a great big country. Ukraine's a small country. But like, that is kind of the way of the world. And the idea that we can just undo that is not living in reality.
Well, especially when we're the ones doing it. I mean, this is the whole thing. The famous Henry Kissinger quote where he says, to be America's enemy is dangerous. To be America's friend is fatal. What he was talking about was building up groups and then stabbing them in the back and leaving them high and dry. And I forget exactly. I think he's talking about the Kurds then, which he betrayed the Kurds at least twice himself, I think. It may have been a reference to the Hmong tribesmen of Laos and kind of northwestern Vietnam, that the CIA backed them to take on the North Vietnamese. And then it was like, okay, well, we're leaving. Good luck to you guys. After we just, encourage you to turn yourselves into the avowed deadly enemies of these people who have so much more power than you do. So bye. And didn't even help them get out of there, They do the same thing to the Kurds over and over again. I don't know. The Iraqi Kurds are in a pretty good spot with America now, but they've been stabbed in the back by America at least twice in the 1980s. And then again, after the end of the first Iraq war. And then the Syrian Kurds in Turkey, in northeastern Syria, claim we love them, and then built up the Islamist caliphate that became their absolute deadly enemy when it conquered, all of that land in eastern Syria and western Iraq. We had to go in there and fight another war for them, and we're still there protecting them now. Otherwise, what? They'll be overrun by our other allies, the Turks, and they're again agents on the move, Al Qaeda, that now rules Damascus and the rest of western Syria. And this kind of thing happens over and over again. And so here, I mean, what could be a worse thing than to get your friend into a fight that he can't win? And then to keep pushing him out there, stay out there. Lindsey Graham, quote unquote, how dare you not lower your draft age to 18? right now it's 25, but they try to send the older men to the front and leave the younger men behind to do, equipment and logistics and whatever, the background stuff, because their population is decimated and they're terrified of losing all of their reproductive age males. And so they're sending all middle-aged guys to go and get ground up. And then Lindsey Graham won't stand for it and stomps his foot and says the draft age should be 18 and those boys should be at the front. How in the hell are you ever going to win this war if you don't send your 18-year-olds to the front? Which is, I'm sorry, but just none of his damn business to be insisting that another nation do to sacrifice for his goals for them or his goals for America's geopolitical contest with Russia, where they, there's a clip of, was it Kissinger or I confuse these absolute idiot Russiagate Democrats from the House, Dave, from that era. I think it was Kissinger was saying just yesterday, there was a clip going around on X of him saying that, look, we're killing Russians and no American soldiers are dying. It's the best bang for our buck we've ever spent. And I have a whole section of quotations like that in the book where over and over again, these pundits and writers and politicians in America say this. And in numerous cases, they don't even mention the Ukrainian deaths at all. They'll say Russian soldiers are dying and American soldiers are being preserved. It's great. So the Russian soldiers have lives to be degraded, and our soldiers their lives have value to be degraded, and our soldiers' lives have value to be preserved. The Ukrainians aren't even worth mentioning at all.
Do you remember? Was it
over there?
Do you remember? I'm sure you'll remember because you're Scott Horton. Do you remember? I think it was Wolf Blitzer who asked Rand Paul a few years back about Yemen, and he seemed kind of confused, and he went like, "So to you, this is a moral issue?" Like he was like, because what I'm hearing is like this is really good for business, but like, so you're saying you have a moral problem with backing a genocide?
Yeah, I think he even said, like, this could really cost the American arms firms that are selling these weapons. And Rand Paul was as flabbergasted as Wolf Blitzer. Like, what did you just say, dude? I'm as confused as you are, Wolf. What in the world, man?
Well, I had my version of this moment when I was debating Josh Hammer at Princeton a few weeks ago, and he turned to me at one of his questions to me was he was like, so do you make moral considerations when considering foreign policy? And I was like almost taken back by the question. I was like, well, like yeah, that's a big part of it, sure. And I just say that just to make the point that like you kind of can't overstate how fucking evil these goddamn people's like worldview is. Yeah. Like where they can totally just accept the idea that it's like, yeah, like I'm pushing a policy that will lead to slaughter, but I think that all things being considered, it's Madeleine Albright, just like, yeah, that price is worth it. Was it 500,000 dead kids? Okay, worth it. Like that's the mentality.
This is my 4th grade education in government school, man, is that, when they teach you about war and stuff, that, yeah, civilians in the other country, they die, but that's their problem. That's not our problem to consider. And there may be, they might allude to the Geneva Conventions and some rules of war, but it's no sin for your government to kill people in another country. That's between them and their government, not between us and like certainly. And then they'll turn it around and they'll say, no, see, the evil amoralist realist strategists, they only care about balance of power politics. They don't care about morality at all. We want a morality-based foreign policy. That's why we have to invade Iraq to stop Saddam Hussein. Don't you know he throws people in a giant human shredder? And whatever nonsense they make up to invoke your emotions and say, yes, this is the morality-based foreign policy. America can do no wrong in stopping evil around the world. So those are your 2 choices, either Henry Kissinger or Paul Wolfowitz.
Yep. Do you remember, it was like, I guess a couple it must have been, it was the 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq. So 2 years ago. So that Brett Stevens wrote a piece in the New York Times called like 20 years later why I was still right. So it's like the last guy defending the Iraq war. Like, yeah, I think it's him and Cheney.
Yeah.
And I think
John Bolton. They're the last three in America.
Those are the last, like, it's like even John McCain, admitted on his deathbed that it was bad, it's but so he writes this piece about, like, 20 years later, I was right to cheerlead the war in Iraq. I think he was writing for I think he was writing for the Jerusalem Post at the time.
Yeah, he was the editor.
Isn't that convenient? See how that works. But so, and he writes this whole piece and there was not one mention of the deaths from the war. It was just like a piece like, hey, Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, and now they're having some elections and they're an imperfect democracy, but they're coming up there. It's definitely better than it was back then. And so, as if you could take a snapshot of, like, forget even the argument, which I think there's a pretty strong argument that for the average Iraqi, life was actually better under Saddam Hussein. But regardless of that, the idea that, like, you could take a snapshot of Iraq under Saddam Hussein and then take a snapshot of Iraq today, and if today is better than Saddam Hussein, then policy justified. But, like, you're missing the part where you killed 1 million people in the middle of that. Like, I don't know, life ain't better for them. It's over for them.
Yeah. I remember when Bill Clinton left office, he goes, well, at the end of the day, I like to think that we did a little bit more good than harm.
Like, that's the...
Yeah.
But there is, and it's almost like, it is some, like, collective, like, sociopathy. Like, there's something about when you have a mentality that, like, people can be crushed, and that, you know what I mean? People are essentially pawns on a chessboard, and as long as you're moving in the right direction, then that's like an irrelevant factor. It is unbelievable, the levels of evil that can lead to. And then you end up supporting something like, all these people getting slaughtered in Ukraine for nothing, all for nothing.
Yep. And look, just like on the Piers Morgan show yesterday, and anybody can log on to X and see it all day. The Hawks, they only talk in these vague analogies, and they only talk in glittering generalities. And they say, oh, we're turning our back and stabbing our friends in the back and all these things. They never say, what's the solution to the problem? Well, what we need to do is send in the 82nd Airborne and the U.S. Navy. And that would solve the problem, right? Like, if we did like George W. Bush in Iraq and sent the 3rd Infantry Division and the Marine Corps and everybody in there to break things as much as possible, then potentially they could drive the Russians out of Ukraine's south and east. They could also potentially start a hydrogen bomb war, which Joe Biden was not willing to risk. To that degree, right? He has some special operations forces there serving as advisors and stuff like that. But I've never seen that our guys are on the ground fighting there. They're picking targets pretty close to fighting, but but they weren't willing to risk that. Nobody's willing to really risk that. So this is the same thing that Obama said to Jeffrey Goldberg back in 2014, that ultimately Ukraine is not really a vital American interest. It is a vital Russian one. And it's going to always mean more to them than us. And if we're not really, as he put it, if people in Washington want to say that we should go to war for the Donbass, and let them say that. I don't hear anybody saying that. So if you're not willing to say that, then I don't know why we should sort of half-ass it, essentially.
Well, it's essentially because...
And by the way, it was his fault. He overthrew the government, and he was responsible for the loss of Crimea. As he admits in there, it was a reaction to our transition of the government there, he said, which was completely correct. But he was also right that now what are we going to do? We're going to double down. We're going to fight a war in the Donbass? No, we're not going to.
Well, it's an important point to make, because you're essentially calling their bluff. And, it's like I made this point a lot just during the last 8 years of Donald Trump being the biggest political figure, where it's like and it was really never more apparent than when he got shot. And really, I think this is a huge part of what won him the election, is that it immediately just called all of their bluffs. Because, like, you can't wish Hitler a speedy recovery, man. Like, if you do, then you didn't really believe he was Hitler. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, if you're gonna talk the way MSNBC talks every day, then stay consistent. Celebrate when a dude takes a shot at him. Man, it's a shame he missed, right? I mean, if you're really telling me that a Hitlerian figure has risen and is the end of our democracy, then why exactly shouldn't I be rooting for that guy to get shot? And in a similar sense, all these guys, they're making the argument that we don't have to be worried about nuclear war. Putin's bluffing. He would never actually do that, but he is reconstituting the Soviet Union, and it's the most important fight for democracy ever that we maintain Ukrainian, I don't know what was Ukraine a democracy for 5 minutes? I mean, like, I don't know what, like, I guess in 2014, they overthrew the democratically elected leader. And then I guess they had a couple elections in between there. And then they suspended elections after. Yeah. Right. They suspended a portion of right.
George Soros bragged to the New Yorker in 1995 that he rigged the election of 1994. And then you had America overthrow and intervene in the election of 2004 in the Orange Revolution. Then they had a legit election in 2010. They overthrew that guy in 2013, 14. So yeah, it's not much of a democracy. And that's why, even George Soros's Transparency International ranks them with the lowest kleptocracies on the planet, the most corrupt countries in the world. Their political and economic system are just nothing but cronyism from top to bottom, and everybody knows it, and nobody can even lie about it with a straight face. That was part of Biden's somewhat convincing excuse for going after the prosecutor. There was the prosecutor wasn't going after everybody enough. Now, he really ran up against the laugh test when he said he was mad that they weren't prosecuting his son's company. Wait a minute. But boy, was there a lot of corruption for him to go after there if he was picking the right sides,
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it's always been corrupt under the Yanukovych government, Poroshenko's government, Zelensky's government. There's always just been like rampant corruption in Ukraine. It's got, but what was it? Yanukovych's son, I think, was like the 5th richest man in Ukraine, and he was like a dentist. Like, it just didn't even make sense at all. You're like, what? How? Yeah, it's like some crazy stat like that. Look, I know you had an out that was 5 minutes ago, so let me let you go get to your next show. Oh. The Libertarian Institute has their fund drive going on. Let's mention that before we get out of here.
Yeah, thank you for remembering. I forgot. Yes, I am the director of the Libertarian Institute. I got about 25 of the best writers and authors and podcasters. We're constantly putting out great new books and everything like that. And we've got $25,000 worth of matching funds right now. So anything that you donate to the Institute gets doubled. You write it off on your taxes, and then we have all kinds of great kickbacks, including books and stuff like that. So that's all at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And thank you very much.
Absolutely. Could not recommend it higher. There's no better organization to donate to. So thank you for taking the time, Scott. We'll talk again soon. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more in the coming weeks and months of developments to talk about. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Catch you next time. Peace.